Good afternoon. We'll be calling the meeting to order of the Ordinance Committee. May we start with a roll call?
Okay. Ordinance Committee Chair Kristen Sneddon.
Here.
Mayor Kathy Murillo.
Here.
Councilmember Randy Rouse.
Here.
Thank you. Do we have any changes to the agenda? No. Okay. And public comment for items not on the agenda? No. Okay, thank you. With that, we will invite staff report on our first subject, vessel speed limit in the Stearns Wharf Y.
That the Ordinance Committee recommend that City Council adopt an ordinance amending Section 17.12 of the Santa Barbara Municipal Code, establishing a vessel speed limit of 5 nautical miles per hour in the Stearns Wharf Y.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair and members of the Ordinance Committee. My name is Mick Cronman. I'm Harbor Operations Manager, and I'll be presenting this brief report for you today. So this is, as a spoiler, if you will, a diagrammatic spoiler. This is the area we're going to be talking about. This is the Y of Stearns Wharf. It's basically bounded by the roadway on the left or west and the shoreward finger on the east. By way of background, we annually at the Waterfront Department review Title 17 of the Municipal Code to provide continued and clear legal authority for our projects, programs, and operations. And for boating and personal safety this year, an item that actually not only got onto our radar, but was very much advanced to us as something to attend to by the Harbor Commission, the chair of the Harbor Commission, was looking at a speed limit in the Stearns Wharf Y of 5 nautical miles an hour. And here's why. First of all, in terms of entitlements or enabling legislation, state law, specifically Section 660 of the Harbors and Navigation Code, provides authority for cities to enact special use areas or speed zones, as the one we're going to propose in the Y. Examples of that, we've used it for our permitted mooring and anchorage areas east of the wharf. We've also used it to establish a 5 nautical mile per hour speed limit in the harbor proper. That being said, speed limits in the Y have yet been unaddressed, and it's partially because the Y is not technically part of the harbor. The harbor actually is designed to its eastern boundary, starting with Stearns Wharf and moving to the west. So in the Y, what do we have? We have a variety of boat traffic. It's a very, very active place. We have motorized crafts, skiffs, stand-up paddle boards, kayaks, sailboats, every kind of a small boat you can imagine. Plus, we have wharf divers. We have Santa Barbara City College's Dive Tech program trains there. And now we have some Nautica events there, like water polo. So we thought this was a good area to look at to possibly as a candidate for a speed limit, because we've had recently, and I'll get to this, some unfortunate events here that brought to light the necessity for this. In fact, because of these high-speed activities, and a lot of these are boats going to and from the mooring area and from the East Beach anchorage, they tend to go through from the harbor between the pilings of Stearns Wharf, zoom through the Y, and with all these activities, and plus in light of the fact we did have a high-speed accident in the Y last year where 3 people were pitched overboard, $20,000 of damage to Stearns Wharf, and but for fortune, there weren't even more disastrous consequences. So in conclusion, in light of these activities and that boat accident, we're recommending a maximum speed of 5 nautical miles an hour in the Stearns Wharf, as diagrammed in this, as noted in this diagram here, and there's an attachment without the arrow that will be part of the ordinance for reference purposes in the municipal code. And with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Do we have any questions from the committee? No. Mayor Murillo?
Thank you, Mr. Cronman. Did you have a public comment at the Harbor Commission meeting?
Mayor Murillo, no. This was roundly supported, and thank you for reminding me, it was unanimously supported by the Harbor Commission with no public comment.
Thank you.
Mayor Pro Tem Rouse?
Unless there's further questions, I'd like to move staff recommendation.
I'll second that if there's no public comment here today. Any slips? No. Second.
Okay, thank you. Let's take a vote. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Passes unanimously. Thank you. No. Okay, do we need to take recess for a minute or no? Okay. So then on to item 2, draft charter amendments to implement district elections under the California Voting Rights Act and even numbered year elections under the California Voter Participation Rights Act. With that, I'd like to invite staff report. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Sned and members of the committee. The committee today is being asked to look at a couple of sets of charter amendments that relate to 2 distinct subject matter areas. The first area has been around the longest, and that is the district elections amendments. As you'll recall, in 2015, the City Council settled a lawsuit under the California Voting Rights Act by moving the city towards district elections. That settlement's self-executing. There is no technical requirement to amend the charter, but it is very disconcerting and confusing to have the charter talk about at-large provisions while the city operates under district election rules. There are a couple of areas related to those district election settlement issues that we'll talk about where problems have arisen under the charter that could use fixing, but it's not mandatory. The second part of this that we'll talk about, and I'll launch into the slides in a minute, is the so-called Voter Participation Rights Act, which last November the City Council, in light of the California Attorney General's opinion that even chartered cities must move towards even-year elections, even numbered year elections, directed us to prepare Voter Participation Rights Act even-year election amendments to propose this fall as required in order to avoid potential liability come come this year had you not adopted that plan to move to even-year elections last November. So with that introduction, let's go to the slides. And let's see if I can make it more less vibrating. That's good. There it goes. Okay, so we discussed some of the background. So what we want to try and accomplish today is to really give a detailed technical review to the draft language. Now, that language is in your report, but for the convenience of everybody in the room, I have copies at your places of the 2 charter amendments, and I'm sure we're going to want to work off of those as the meeting progresses, and I know the public has those. So we're going to review those amendments. We'll hear from the public. The hope here is that your committee will give me direction on a package to bring back to the City Council with your affirmative recommendation. And the November date was established by the Council last fall. So, now, fortunately, the number of issues is pretty small. So if you want to follow along on the district elections charter amendment, I will cross-reference it as I address these slides. So we're looking at the one that says California Voting Rights Act, District Elections Charter Amendments. Now, what this slide is attempting to do is identify where you have choices. All of the other issues in this amendment are prescribed by the settlement. So let's run through the text of the district elections amendment so we can match it up to this slide. Section 500.
Excuse me, Mr. Klunk. May I ask
Yes,
you a question?
certainly.
In our staff report, we had option 1 and 2, and then we had the Ochoa letter. Is this draft that we're looking at, does this correspond most closely to option 1 or option 2? If we took notes in those.
It is identical to the exhibits.
Attachment 1, oh, exhibit 1.
And let me see what they, I've forgotten how they were numbered. I apologize. Yeah, attachment 1 is the Voting Rights Act. That's what we're working off of now.
Okay, thank you.
And it's identical.
Thank you.
Okay. So Section 500 is the part of the charter that really just generally describes at-large elections. It's not the place where we detail how elections are going to work. That happens later on in the charter, and we'll get there in section or chapter 13, title 13, article 13, excuse me. All this does is say that we are going to have district elections. So it's very technical. The strikeout is the transition language from the late 60s. That transition language is replaced later on in the amendment. So don't worry about that big deletion for now in Section 500. All we've done here in Section 500 is say that we're going to go to district elections. I don't think you have any choice there in terms of how that's worded. That's all out of the settlement. Okay, the next one, 500.1, City Council limitations on terms. This is purely optional for the City Council to get into. I am advising that you do because even this last year we had a question with former Councilmember Conklin and whether he would qualify for mayor. When the term limits were written, the City Council's position, and it is the City Council that wrote them, as well as my predecessor, is that the language said you could serve 2 consecutive terms on the City Council and 2 consecutive terms on the mayor, and then you were done, as the mayor, and then you were done. In the Conklin case, Mr. Conklin had served 4 terms as a council member. So the court pretty much disregarded the mayor service part of that and said, having served 4 terms as a council member, you're disqualified from being the mayor. That was not what anyone intended. So this cleanup addresses that. As a practical matter, I have to admit, I don't think this situation can ever come up again because we'll never have another 4-term council member. So I'm adding this language. I'm recommending adding it because it is a true statement of what the council's intent was in the 90s. It's my belief as to what the law is. The Court of Appeal out there raised doubts about it in dictum in Hal Conklin's case, which is part of why we concluded that he could run this time, notwithstanding that he served 4 terms before. So this is not really going to change anything, but it's a much clearer statement to the world of how the term limits are supposed to work, and I think it's appropriate.
Can I ask you a question
Please.
at this point about understanding this? So the change from cumulatively to consecutively, does that mean someone could come back after a break and
Yes.
then start a new consecutive? Okay.
Yes, and that's what the Court of Appeal inferred in ruling that Mr. Conklin could run some years down the road. So at the very end of the unpublished appellate decision, and unpublished means it's not law, but they still gave us an idea of what they thought the law would be. At the end of that opinion, they said that a separation in service for some period of years would clear Conklin to run again for mayor.
And then one more question on that with consecutively and the vice versa terminology. Does that mean someone could do city council, mayor, back to city council? Does it matter the order?
I don't believe so.
So consecutively in any combination of those?
Correct.
Thank you.
Correct. One area that what it doesn't do that I've mentioned in the past but chose not to add is it doesn't specify a required break in service. So some of these charter term limits that are consecutive rather than cumulative or lifetime will say you have to be out of office for X months, X years before you can run again. So I'm not proposing that. That would be a substantive change different from what the council previously directed.
Mayor Pro Tem Rouse?
Hey, Mr. Colon, I've read about this example somewhere, but in case of an interim appointment, and then that interim appointee then runs for office, how does that language pertain to that?
It doesn't. We have only the opinion of my predecessor that a full more than 2 years of a term would have been required. Now, having said that, what Mr. Wiley believed was that this section didn't preclude an appointed partial term of any length, which is, I believe, your situation. Your initial appointed term was for 1 year. Yeah. So you were less than half a term. So the way I would interpret it without any words in it is that if you're over 2 years, I would call that a term.
Thank you.
But that's very debatable given the way
That's
it's
an
written.
interpretation, not necessarily.
Correct.
Right.
Correct.
Mayor Murillo?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So using the word consecutive means somebody does have to take a break before they come back.
Right. Cumulative is synonymous with lifetime, meaning once you've served your time, you can never come back.
Okay.
And the confusion in the existing term limits is that whoever drafted it was very ill-advised to use cumulative and consecutive in the same sentence because they mean very different things.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. All right. Now, moving on to Section 1300. Some of what I did was addressing the numbering so that the two measures would work together or apart. And we have a slide talking about that a little bit later. So let me complete this Article 13 work. 1301 here has been modified. What I did in order to avoid creating a bunch of new sections is I took former 1301, which was special elections, and just merged that into 1300. There was no need for a separate section. So 1301 is essentially verbatim out of the settlement agreement. And it lays out all the agreed upon procedures between now and 2031 for district elections. There were a few changes that were made part of that settlement that are worth mentioning. The biggie is that redistricting is something that happens with the decennial census, and the next time we will be going through that process is in 2021. And the idea is to make sure that the community demographics have not changed in a way that renders any of the districts either too big, too small, or creating further minority vote dilution, which is what we're trying to avoid with district elections. I'm told that the odds of big changes between now and 2021 and now and 2031 are not likely. You know, there's not a lot of vacant space to be redeveloped, but this process is there. Now, I mention it primarily for the last sentence on page 4. The settlement agreement committed the city to the Independent Redistricting Commission consisting of 3 retired judges.
I'm sorry, page 4
of the Voting Rights Act handout. So it's in red? Yeah.
We
Or-
only have to page 3.
On voting rights, I've jumped over to,
The draft Voter Participation Rights Act Charter Amendments. And it does not have section 503 in it.
so Voter Participation Rights Act is one document. The other that we're talking about is Voting Rights Act, and it should have 6 pages.
Madam Chair, it's in the agenda packet.
Oh, the handout's messed up?
The handout
sorry.
ends at 3.
Okay.
But we're
yeah,
looking
so
at-
attachment 1, yeah, my apologies, page 4 of attachment 1 then.
Thank you.
Mine's complete. I don't know. Do you guys have it? All right, thanks. Okay, what I added, your hands are tied through 2031. How the city does districting in the post-2031 is undecided. And most cities have the city council actually make the district decisions and use advisory bodies such as an independent commission or a citizens blue ribbon, something like that. What I've gone ahead and done is answer the question, what will you do after 2031, by giving the council the authority to do districting and the authority to use any entity or person to assist. So if you want to continue with independent redistricting, which has worked well for the state of California, then you'll be able to do that, but you won't be compelled to do so. In looking critically at the work we did in 2015 for the redistricting process, I'm a little worried about finding 3 retired out-of-county judges without spending an arm and a leg to compensate them for their time and travel. So you don't have to go there. You don't have to have that last sentence, but that's a suggestion for you to think about. Okay, now that is the second point on the slide that you should have up there now.
May I
The
ask
first
a
point,
question about that at
Yes.
this point? So if there was redistricting, would the results of that come out in time that a district representative, so say I'm District 4, and say now where I live is redistrict and I'm District 1, would I get notification by the redistricting in time, I guess, I don't know, to move for 30 days to a new district or to handle that situation? When would the results of that redistricting be enacted?
okay, in under the settlement, they can't be enacted until the 2021 election. It is supposed to be submitted in April. So the theory in the settlement was that April 1, this commission would have a map done. You'd have plenty of time as a candidate to know what district you're in. So that was the approach. In order to make the settlement work, I added language requiring the council as a mandate to approve the independent commission's work. I think I'm pretty clear there that it's not intended to give the council any discretion to change it, but the council approval is an action that's essential to allow challenges and all of that. Okay, so now back to the first bullet. I'm sorry I took them out of order. Special elections for vacancies. In January, and we're in the first
Mayor
slide
Murillo
yet.
has a question.
Oh, certainly.
I'm sorry, were you leaving attachment 1 and the discussion about the independent commission, Mr.?
I am, yes.
Okay. So it says here that someone who serves on the commission cannot run for city council for a certain period of time. But you said that doesn't apply to running for mayor? That's what the draft says. The previous sentence does not apply to seeking election to the office of mayor.
That's verbatim from the settlement.
Oh, okay. That came from the settlement.
Right.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, so we can wrap up with this slide now. Special elections for vacancies. In January, the council took the view that the charter did not address what to do about mayoral vacancies after district elections. So, notwithstanding the charter language that the council would appoint the next highest vote getter, of which there was none, the council directed a special election for this November. Having heard that direction once, the Voting Rights Act language under vacancies, page 2, section 503, now would expressly authorize you to do a special election for the mayoral appointment. What I did not do is include special election as an option for council vacancies. And I did not do that because it's a political question the council hasn't addressed. And so if you wish to do that, which is certainly what the Banyalis plaintiffs would prefer, their view, if I can summarize it, is that the charter should prefer special elections. If you want to go that route as to council vacancies, we can do that, but I'll need direction to do it. So having said all of that, I know that Councilmember Hart has expressed interest or may even be nominated for the supervisor seat. Were he to move to the Board of Supervisors, under current law, his vacancy would be an appointment with no option to conduct a special election. And according to the charter, that appointment would last only until the next election, at which time a real successor for Councilmember Hart's seat would be elected for the remainder of the term. So if you play it out, if he was elected in 2017, that would mean at the 2019 elections, a successor to your appointee would be appointed to serve until 2021. Excuse me, would be elected to serve until 2021. With me? You would appoint a successor from whenever Hart's seat becomes vacant to the next election in the fall of 19, then the people would vote on a 2-year replacement. That's the way that works. Okay, so that's an option for you. I haven't...
Just to follow up on my earlier question then, so that appointee then could be eligible to run in the successive election, but then would have already served the equivalent of a term because they were longer than the...
If they were more than 2 years, yes.
Right, so they could run, but they would be running for a 4-year term only. Not be able to run again after that term, because they will have served then 2 terms under the technical definition of...
That'd be my advice. It's not black letter law. The way to fix that problem is to put a separation, a period in the code.
Right. Thank you.
So if you want 2 years or 1 year before it's counted as a full term, that's what you would say. The language around the state reads typically service of more than X months constitutes a full term for the purposes of this section.
And then as this section is written, am I interpreting this correctly, that each city council would have to make the decision to either, for mayor succession, to either fill by appointment or by special election? So that would be decided each time by city council?
Correct. And there is a further decision hidden in there. the 30 days of the preceding election means that it would be the existing council, not the newly elected council, that made the appointment. You can change that as well. It's interesting that the timing for the appointments in the existing charter differs for the mayor than for the council members. That one is measured from the date of the vacancy, the other is measured from the date of the election.
Mayor Murillo?
Thank you. So you're taking this position because on a city council vacancy should be an appointment because that's what our charter says now.
Madam Chair, Mayor Murillo, no, I'm not taking a position on it at all. All I'm saying is that I have not been given any policy direction except with respect to mayoral special elections. If the council wishes to have special elections for regular council vacancies, that's fine. You can do it. I just haven't been directed to do that.
Okay, but the charter says appointment.
Correct.
Thank you.
For a limited term. Appointment until the next election at which the person to fill out the remainder of the 4 years can be elected. Okay? All right, let's move on. Oh, yeah, I've already addressed this. This is the cleanup on the Conklin issue. Okay, so now we're going to move to the next handout, which is the Voter Participation Rights Act. And there is no
attachment 2, Madam Chair. Is that attachment 2?
Yes. Thank you. And it is 3 pages. Okay, so the even year elections is pretty simple. The state law would like you to have the even year elections by 2020. We're not able to do that because of the Banyala settlement. The Banyala settlement, in my read, assures the council members elected in 2015 and 2017 that their terms won't be shortened lower than 4 years. So that means the city has no choice under that settlement but to conduct elections in 19 and 21. That being the case, the earliest you can actually get to an even year election would be if in the fall of 2018 the charters changed to go to even year elections. In 2019, the candidates from districts 1, 2, and 3 would be elected for and serve 5-year terms until 2024. In 2021, the existing incumbents in districts 4, 5, and 6, and any challengers, would run for 5-year terms, one-time 5-year terms, ending in 2026. Now, the council did not address which group the mayor's election should be synchronized with. Currently, the mayor's election is synchronized with 4, 5, 6 this year. And so what I did with that, let me find it. At the top of page 3, what made sense to me, and you may have a different way to do it, is that the mayor would serve out the existing 4-year term. We don't get in the question of shortening terms, although I think theoretically you could by up to 12 months. and then would have a 5-year term in 2021 to get synchronized back with the 4, 5, 6 seats. So in other words, you're staying on the same rotation the way I've written it, but it will be quite a while before we have an actual even year elected mayor, that while being until 2026. All right. So that's it for the even year elections. Pretty straightforward. Now,
Mayor Pro Tem Rouse has a question.
So, Mr. Colon, in that case of the 5-year terms, does an exception have to be made then in writing to 500.1 in terms of the term limits language?
It does, and I did that in 1301.5 up on page 3. The initial 5-year terms authorized shall be considered 4 years for the purposes of 500.1.
Right, thank you.
So I think that was the easy. I'm open to technical fixes, but that was the easiest way I could write it that people would understand.
And on section 500, the first sentence still reads, all to be elected from the city at large. Is that
Perfect. I had this discussion a few hours ago with Judge Ochoa, and this slide tries to address why I did it that way. And there are other ways to do it. So anytime you have two measures that address the same subject matter, you have to address what happens if one passes and not the other, what happens if both pass, what happens if neither pass. Here, in my thinking, the district election amendments are in some respects optional because with the exception of the vacancy process, they won't change what we're already bound to by the settlement agreement. Now, meaning if the voters reject district elections, we still have district elections. We're bound to them. You can't say that about even year. If the voters reject even year elections, the council's stance is actually, city attorney, defend us. We don't agree that even year elections are mandated for chartered cities. We think we still have a choice to do odd rather than even numbered year elections because the Voter Participation Rights Act is not intended to preempt local control in chartered cities. And for reasons I won't go into, in November I was very critical of our very esteemed Attorney General's opinion on this subject. They equated greater turnout at an election with the fundamental right to vote. The fundamental right to vote is protected by the Voting Rights Act because when an individual of a protected minority class has their vote diluted, meaning they vote but it doesn't matter because they're outnumbered all the time by the majority group, they are effectively losing their right to vote. The same argument can't be made for even years. There is no evidence that it is any more burdensome for someone to get to the poll in an even year than in an odd year. There is evidence that more people show up in even years, but it's not a function of a disability imposed by the government through that date. Minority vote dilution is effectively a disability created by the government. So to my way of thinking, the important constitutional concerns that the courts said justified district elections even in chartered cities don't apply to even year elections.
Say that last sentence again. I'm sorry, Madam Chair. Can you just say
The
that
Voting Rights Act is protecting the fundamental right to vote. The Voter Participation Rights Act is not. It is, I don't believe, the same constitutional concern arises from voting in an odd year as does the effective loss of your vote when you're a minority whose vote has been diluted under the Voting Rights Act. The impact's not the same. So anyway, that's all an aside because the council said we want to go to even years. But I have to anticipate what happens if the voters reject it as they did 9-10 years ago. So I frame them as separate measures. So let's say that we run into a very antagonistic voting population in November and neither measure passes. Bañales will continue to do what we have to do. And meaning district elections will go forward as required by the settlement. If there are vacancies, we'll address it as required by the charter and settlement. If the even year measure does not pass, the city is vulnerable to litigation under this Voter Participation Rights Act. And to fully understand this, the relationship between the city council and the charter and the people needs to be understood. So I'm going to take a slight detour. In the case of the Voting Rights Act, many cities were confronted with the problem that, yes, we want to have district elections to avoid millions of dollars of litigation expense and because it's the right thing to do, but our voters won't approve it. The state legislature stepped in and gave cities the power to impose district elections by ordinance without going to the voters for a vote. We don't have a similar power for even year elections. So if the voters refuse to accept even year elections, there is no mechanism by which the city council can impose it upon the city. The only way it could be imposed would be a successful lawsuit under the Voter Participation Rights Act, resulting in a court order telling us to go to even year elections.
So we would not have the option of giving the voters a choice of how to get to even year elections as their only options. It would have to be also given the choice whether to go to even year elections. That's not a decision.
Correct. Okay. You could break the Voter Participation Rights Act question up itself. You could make three measures. You could have a measure that said, shall we go to even years? And then you could have a measure that gave alternatives for how to do even year elections if you had questions about how that would work. And really those questions, in my mind, come out when you look at the timing of when the even year gets switched in, and when you're talking about 5-year terms versus 3-year terms. What the council seemed to want to do last fall was avoid changing the term of anyone who had already been elected. The thinking, if I remember it correctly, was that if the candidate and the voters understand that it's a different term at the time they're elected, that's fine. But we, City Council, don't feel comfortable lengthening or shortening terms absent some voter participation in that decision. So that's how we ended up with the 5-year terms the way we did. Okay, now 1 or 2 measures. If I understand correctly, the plaintiffs would prefer a single measure, and it may be that that's less confusing. I've just explained to you why I broke them up, but yeah, that slide is essentially what I already said, so I'm not going to go back through it. I do want to segue on this. I think I've touched all 3 of these. They'd prefer one amendment. They prefer creating a charter preference for filling vacancies by special election. And the last thing I want to touch on is the technical method by which I proposed integrating the two measures, because once you understand this, you'll be able to read them and know what I was doing. Judge Ochoa raised a concern with me in our conversations about one, and I believe I heard it from Chair Sneddon, that the one Section 500 includes district elections and the other does not. Okay? So if neither of them passes, we don't have anything to worry about. Existing Section 500 exists. We do district elections. We're exposed to liability for odd year elections. All right. Now, if the Voting Rights Act district elections piece passes, the very last sentence on your attachment 1 says basically that if there are two sections passed that change Section 500, the one in the Voting Rights Act prevails. Okay? So what if you compare the two Section 500s, one with district elections, one without, what we're saying is that if neither of them pass, neither is effective. If both pass, the district elections language is the prevailing language. Okay?
Mayor Murillo has a question, then I have a question also
Okay,
after.
please.
So you say the Banyalas plaintiffs, they want one amendment, not two. You mean on the ballot?
Correct.
The ballot. They want two ballot questions. One ballot question. I guess we'll hear on that when they come up.
I believe that's correct.
Okay. Thanks. That was it.
So just to clarify, the reason for keeping the language all to be elected from city at large in the Section 500 in attachment 2 would be in the case that neither passed, we would then still be keeping the language of at-large elections, but effectively acting as district elections?
Okay, let me run through, and I'm kind of locked into thinking about it this way. Scenario 1 is neither pass. Existing charter continues. We do district elections in odd years, as we have been. Okay. Scenario 2, they both pass. If they both pass, the district elections language in Section 500 replaces the Section 500 in the even year measure. If district elections passes and even year fails, the district elections language prevails. All right? So it's only in the situation where even year passes and districts fail that the at-large language remains in Section 500. It is inoperable, however, because of the settlement. Okay? So that's why I did it that way. Now, the other choice is the other way around. If you look at the end of Attachment 2, it says in the event that the Voter Participation Rights Act measure is approved, it's going to prevail in Section 1300. So if you take a second and compare your Section 1300s, you'll see why we did that. So the difference in the two is that Section 1300, which would prevail if the even year passes, accommodates even years by mentioning 2024 and takes out all the odd year references. Okay? So you want that to prevail. So it's my belief that the two measures are integrated properly, and that's confirmed too. If you look down at the next section under Voter Participation Rights Act, instead of duplicating 1301, I've created a new 1301.5 so that if 1301 on Banyalis election districts passes, then 1301.5 on even year won't need to interrelate with 1300. They'll both work together automatically since they're different sections. So the only technical overlap I found was in 500 and 1300. Judge Ochoa is, I know, will test that. So I think it's right, but all the testing, the better. So.
If in attachment 2, section 500, if that was just eliminated, and I'm not making suggestions yet, I'm just clarifying. If you just eliminated all to be elected from city at large, but just left at the times and in the manner provided in the charter, would that also address that same issue? You could then take that line out and just have it as defined in the charter, and then whatever the charter changes.
Chair Sneddon, I think that'll work. Yeah, I think that'll work. Maybe that's less confusing to the voter. My worry was that if you, it seems a cleaner communication to be able to say that even the even year measure doesn't bias you one way or another. Now, maybe you have a different political approach. This is not my bread and butter. I just thought of them separately because they're separate subject matters and I could integrate them pretty easily. If you want to merge them, that's great. And I'm open to questions. Otherwise, I'm done talking.
Do we have any questions from the committee? Mayor Murillo?
Okay, Mr. Kahlon, can we go back to the question that Mr. Rouse had about an appointment to fill a council vacancy, and that person would serve 2 years, or would serve the rest of the remaining term, be able to run for re-election or election, run for election for one more term, and then they wouldn't be able to run for another one. Is that what I heard, or is that what I think I heard?
So on the council vacancies currently, I'm not talking about mayor, council, the appointment would be from 30 days of the occurrence of the vacancy until the next regular municipal election. So if Mr. Hart becomes a supervisor and takes office January 1, within 30 days an appointment would be required. That appointee would serve until November of 2021. Excuse me, pardon me, November 2019, at which point an election would be held to fill the seat until 2021 for those final 2 years. My interpretation of the term limits is that if an appointee serves less than 2 years, they have not served a full term. But that is my opinion, unguided by any help in the charter. If you want to add a time increment in there, that would be great. It was not something I wanted to do on my own portfolio. So, appointee could run again in 2 years as it currently stands. And at that point, if the appointed term were less than 2 years, I would tell them they could be elected twice.
Okay. So 2 years or less, they get 2 full terms after that.
That's my opinion.
2 years or more,
Yeah.
That's a good suggestion. Thanks. That's all I have. Thanks.
Mayor Pro Tem Rouse?
So, Mr. Colon, would it make sense then in the charter or in the ballot amendment language to equal the term, the waiting out term for somebody between the consecutive terms? If they were to stand off 2 years not in service, then they could be eligible to run again for 2 more terms. Would it make sense to equate those two as full terms? In other words, 2 years or less or 2 years or greater is a full term, and then the standing off of service as 2 years being counted as enough interim time before you ran again. Does make sense to
It
make-
works legally. In terms of making sense, I guess it's less confusing if you have the same time frame for both.
That's what, just make it like this is the
Yeah.
defined time.
Yeah, you could choose different times, but I understand the advantage of having the same time frame.
Well, I'm just trying to envision explaining all of this to constituents as we come up to the election exactly, and trying to define it so people really understand what they're voting on.
Yeah, so the way we would do this is in the term limit section, we would indicate that partial terms of more than 24 months constitute a full term. So that it would be very simple to say there. And the other issue that the Bonellis plaintiffs have raised that I haven't touched is the disqualification of appointees from running for office. So that's something to think about. I'm sure they'll discuss that more. And if I remember correctly, the idea was to avoid the advantages of incumbency that are there. So.
Well, I think, Madam Chair, I think we're going to get a lot more questions once we hear from these guys.
Just one more question before public comment. I have one, just one. In section 500.1, page 2, in the staff report, it says forbids only 2 sets of consecutive terms and on. Does that mean it allows only 2 sets or permits only 2 sets? It says forbids only 2 sets of consecutive terms.
That doesn't make sense. It must be a mistake in what I wrote.
Okay, then we can move on. We'll get back to that. Okay, so for public, did you have a, no? Okay. So on item 2, our first speaker will be Lanny Ebenstein. Thank you.
Chair Snedden, members of the Ordinance Committee, Mr. Colon, thank you for your service to our community. I wanted to just briefly make some comments and encourage you to have provision for election of vacancies on the City Council. I think one aspect that hasn't been mentioned is that in the Bonellis decision, there is a statement that all members of the council must reside, be nominated, and be elected from their district. And I recognize that there's some view that that didn't apply to appointments, but there is no statement, there is no direct statement in the Bonellis decision that that wording does not apply to appointments. That's an inference. There's no statement to that effect. The statement is that council members must be nominated and elected from their district. I think that the proposal that you've received from Judge Ochoa, which would allow a special election, which would, with flexibility as to when the City Council would call it, whether it would be a standalone special election or consolidated with the next general election, addresses cost considerations. I think that the idea of an interim appointment who can't run is also something that's legal. In San Francisco, there was a city-county charter amendment with this very proposal in recent years. And it's a form of term limits. It's something that the argument that not to allow someone to run for office can't do, that would be an argument against term limits in general. So there's no question that this will stand legal muster. The crucial question is the power of incumbency, and by making an appointment who can run for election, that then allows the appointment process, I think, to have too much power in that sense. Finally, and I recognize that may prevent some good people from running, but I think it's more important that the power of the incumbency isn't granted, and that I think there are good people who would like to have a short appointment. Finally, I think that the cost is not $300,000 for a special election. I hope to have further correspondence to you on that in the near future. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. And next we will have Frank Ochoa, and is Kylie Zachlin here, present? You're giving your time to Judge Ochoa, and Jacqueline Inda also giving time, and Sebastian Aldana Jr. also giving time. So you will have 8 minutes, and if you need to finish thoughts at the end of that, you may have that time also.
Okay. Thank you, Councilmember Sneddon and Mr. Rouse, Ms. Murillo. In listening to the presentation, it occurs to me that the frame of mind is to build on what has existed previously. And I would respectfully submit that that's not where the council is. You're creating a new landscape. You're creating the future landscape. Building on what exists has inherent difficulties, and that is not only true as to the charter itself. I trust Mr. Kalan is correct when he says that the language in the proposed 1301 is directly from the settlement. Well, that then contemplates a commission, redistricting commission of 3 persons composed of judges who live outside of the community, outside Santa Barbara County, and yet enables someone to run for mayor of Santa Barbara. That doesn't make sense. Whoever drafted that in the judgment clearly had a problem, and those things cannot be merged. We have the same problem, Chair Sneddon, that you had with the reference to at-large elections. If it's going to be district elections, I think it's confusing to the population to have references to at-large elections in the new city charter. The reference should be to district election process and molded to that to make it simpler. In regard to vacancies, the old vacancy filling process really has to be done away with and rebuilt with district elections. And here's why. If your fellow council member Hart is, and there's no reason to suspect that he won't be elected to the Board of Supervisors, his position will be open. This charter provision will determine how that vacancy is filled once it's created next January. If it's by appointment by the council, then the appointment will be by 6 persons, none of whom live within his district. How is that meeting the ends of democratic processes? It's not. And the same it would be true of your districts unless the mayor happens to live in your district. 5 out of the 6 people who would select the replacement won't live in the district. That defeats the whole purpose of district elections. So our proposal is to the effect that there would be special elections, a preference for special elections with letting the voting population in the community create incumbency. That's a powerful tool. And it's either vested with the council or it's vested with the individual the voting population in each of your individual districts. That's the bottom line on this issue. Might there be a time when there's too much time needed and you need to fill somebody, put somebody in the spot to make government function? Maybe. So our provision allows that to happen. You can appoint, and this happens in some jurisdictions. Long Beach has a model that's similar to this, where a caretaker can be appointed who is not going to be running for that office, is disabled from running, but can fill the position and perform all the functions required of that council member until the next election. We also, in a sensitivity to the cost issue, have tied the special election process to next general municipal elections, unless you decide otherwise. Unless the council says we're going to vary from the regular general municipal election framework and have a standalone special election. So our proposal is along those lines. And what we're asking the council, you to do, is to give this some more time, give us the opportunity to sit down with Mr. Kalan, discuss these issues, and see if we can get a merged proposal that is simplified. It may take, if it takes modification of the Banyalis judgment, we may need to talk to a few people beyond the folks that are here, but that's doable. There can be an amendment to a judgment. I did that myself many times when I was on the bench, as long as the parties agree. Usually the court doesn't have an issue with that. So if there's an impediment to what we're trying to do to modify this structure, make it more simplified and more democratic, and the impediment exists in the Banyalis judgment, that's an issue that we can sit down and talk about. So we're asking you to refer the matter back to Mr. Kalan for consideration of the issues that we've raised. We set our position out in terms of what we think our model would be for a set of charter amendments that address the district election issues. And we're looking at a model that would be one that could be utilized in other jurisdictions, as opposed to saying this happened here or there or someplace else. In terms of this whole push to district elections, we're kind of at a forefront in terms of the mix of vacancies. I've talked to litigators in this area, and they say, gee, we just haven't had this happen before, as happened last December when the mayor was elected from council to the mayor's position, and now we have another issue coming on. We've kind of a focal point here, and what happens, what you decide can have a ripple effect around the state. So I'd say take a little time, make it happen properly, and we're certainly willing to work with the city attorney's office and see if we can get an agreed upon set of proposals that hopefully council would put forth before the voters. If there are any questions,
Mayor Pro Tem Rouse, questions?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Judge Ochoa, so going back to this, the draft language for the ballot and what we might put forward, we still have the scenario perhaps of voter rejection of this initiative, which, of course, the charter has to change by voter mandate. So in that case, and I know that you were asking about doing a single ballot initiative as opposed to having multiple, and I think I understand why. But in that case, we still have that same scenario that Mr. Kalan pointed out, where, you know, the district elections will go forward no matter what because of the judgment, but then term limits, or not term limits, but the even years, which were historically rejected once before, could very well be rejected again. I can't predict that, but so in that case, you know, number one, I guess, what would be the ideal thing, of course, is to come up with a language we'll agree on. But number two is I don't know what the time frame is between now and our ability to put something on November's ballot. Is there? Do we happen to know, Madam Clerk, or maybe you know, Judge Ochoa? I'm not sure.
Well, Mr. Kalan indicated to me that he was hoping to have this before the entire city council by May 15.
Councilman Rouse, typically the consolidation time with the counties late June, early July.
Okay, so, which actually sounds like kind of a short window, but, you know, given everything else we've got going on.
There's time, and we're willing to put the effort into it in a short window of time.
So, Yeah, okay. I think that's you've answered my questions. And my last thing was I was a little confused on the scenario, the Greg Hart scenario, which is pretty clearly going to happen. So what is your ideal scenario for that? I mean, Mr. Hart does go to the supervisors, and then we have
that once his position is vacant, the council call for a special election to fill that at the next general election, and you would have the option, if you think it's necessary or helpful, to appoint someone to fill that spot until that special election occurs.
Okay, because I do think that some of our work has suffered with the lack of the seventh person on board.
And you've had that experience now. So
Yes, we have.
You have a base of experience
Every Tuesday.
to make that judgment on.
Yeah.
So it doesn't prevent you from, our proposal wouldn't prevent an interim appointment, but it would ensure that it is an interim appointment and that the council would not be creating incumbency by virtue of that appointment. It would be someone who is a caretaker for that position until the special election occurs and that remaining term is filled out.
So in that scenario then, Judge, then you'd say the caretaker or the interim appointee would not then be eligible to run in the subsequent general election.
Right, exactly. Yeah. That's the suggestion.
Thank you.
Mayor Murillo?
I have no questions for Judge Ochoa. I do want to disagree with Mr. Rouse that we've been having trouble with 6 people. We've been doing a good job without the 7th person. Our ADU decisions were measured and negotiated and compromising. So I just want to say that off the top of my head. I don't have questions for you, sir. You do. Okay, thanks.
Thank you. I have a few questions for you. And these don't indicate my decision on this. I'm just interested in your perspective. If the appointment process included the outgoing member, had a vote from Greg Hart, or had a vote, well, I guess it wouldn't work in the mayoral succession because she already had a vote, but would that make a difference if there was a voting member from the district that was going to be appointed?
So your question contemplates a circumstance where it's straight appointment on any vacancy, no special election.
Which I know is not your preference, but would it make a
You'd
difference?
still have the majority of people making the decision who are not residents of the district.
Okay, thank you. And so the caretaker to be appointed, it would be your preference that they would be temporary until the next election because of the power of incumbency?
Exactly.
Okay.
The power of creating incumbency should rest with the voters in that district,
Okay.
not the persons who happen to live in other districts. And it's not a reflection on whether people are qualified who sit on this dais to make that decision. It's who should have that power, who should have that ability to invest in their representative. And our position is that it should be the people that are in that district. The people who are in the 3rd district are making that decision right now.
And was the power of incumbency part of the Benalis judgment at all? Was that referred to or part of the end result?
My recollection is no, but I've just shown that I don't know everything about the terms of the judgment because of that 1300 language, which seems to be conflicting. But I don't think that power of incumbency was addressed as the issue of filling vacancies on its face was not addressed in the judgment.
So from the judgment itself, and this is just for my clarification, that pertains to district elections.
Other than the language that says that people must reside in their districts and be elected by the residents of the district. If you want to view that in an expansive way, then it does contemplate, could be viewed as contemplating
Filling vacancies.
special elections. Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Any further questions for Judge Ochoa? No? Then I believe it's to the committee.
Thank you.
Thank you. Do we want to approach this holistically first, one measure two, or do we want to go through each section and decide those points as we go? Do you have a preference? If no preference, then I would suggest we go through each section. Okay, so let's start with attachment 1, section 500. Do we have any proposed changes or discussion about section 500? Well, I have a question, actually. Are we choosing between attachment 1, attachment 2, and what I'll call the Ochoa option for section 500? Are those or discussing changes among those?
It may not be that dramatic. I understood the concern to be that, not that the Voting Rights Act version that we're looking at right now in Section 500 was a problem, under the attachment 2, 500, was the problem. So your suggestion, Chair Sneddon, was to delete the at-large language from Section 500 of attachment 2 and simply refer to the manner provided in this charter. Yeah.
Do we have any further discussion? How did the two of you agree with, disagree with that amendment in attachment 2?
Yeah, Madam Chair, to be consistent with the Benialis agreement, which is going to prevail no matter what happens in the election, I think that does make sense to make a charter change away from the language that specifies an at-large election.
Okay. Mayor Murillo?
I agree.
Okay. So then we would like that change in attachment 2. Let's keep going through. I don't have any other changes other than accepting the proposed changes from attachment 1, section 500. Any other? Okay. So section 500.1.
The language we discussed briefly about the consecutive terms, what constitutes a term, and the time in between
Yes.
Eligibility.
That's 500.1. Yes.
Right, and that talked about making that consistent and choosing a term like the 24-month idea of what constitutes a complete or a term, and what would constitute an appropriate interim time between eligibility to run again. So if we can incorporate that, Mr. Kalan, or actually back to the committee, I don't know if you agree with that, but that's, I think if we were to define that, it would make it a little clearer, because right now it's a matter of interpretation.
Are you proposing 2 or more years is a complete term?
Correct, as Mr.
and
Kalan
less
referred
than
to,
2 years
24 months.
is incomplete?
And that
or
way
not counted?
you're within the elections, it lines up with the election cycles as well, because we have 3 and then 3 and then, so.
We do have the possibility of someone filling a 2-year term. Oh, no, I guess it would be 3-year term in this one coming up, and then a 5-year term, and then 2 4-year terms. It's a possibility.
It is
Okay.
a possibility, but
not
I
if
think
it
the
were the
voters
3-year.
need to understand, it needs to be as clear as possible as we go into these changes. So even we can explain it.
I would agree with that addition. Mayor Murillo?
Sure. I see Mr. Kalan over there with his red pen, as long as he can make it clear.
Well, let me suggest a sentence that we would insert right before the last sentence of that section. So immediately after the phrase, with no more than 2 consecutive terms in either office, insert any term of elected or appointed service of 2 years or more shall constitute a 4-year term for the purposes of this section.
Excellent. We're in agreement on that change?
Works for me.
Okay. And we accept all other edits in that section, 500.1? We're looking between both attachment 1 and attachment 2. Are we agreed to accept the suggested edits?
Yeah, do these directions need a motion, Mr. City Attorney? Or?
At the end, Mayor Pro Tem, Chair Sneddon, it looks to me like the change you made just now on vacancies in 500.1 in the Voting Rights Act, Attachment 1, should also apply to Attachment 2.
I agree.
Okay, so I'll do that.
Okay, we will now look at section 501. Which attachment 2 did not have a section 501. Is that correct? Only attachment 1. For the eligibility?
That's correct, and I should include it to clean up the gender references. So without objection, I'll insert the same 501 in both.
Thank you.
Good
I
catch.
have to say, I really appreciated the change in the gender references. So thank you
Yeah,
for that
so did my mom in
suggestion.
1965, so
Yes.
it's about time we get
It's
there.
about time. And I suppose we could leave open for discussion at another time whether we wanted to have completely gender neutral for our modern times for the accepted they. Which I think for now we'll leave it as his or her. And we are in agreement on that change? Okay. So then on to section 503, the big one, the vacancies, which are only in our attachment 1. This is where we could give direction to write it with special election for council replacement, or to leave the language as is. Maybe we want to just discuss
Madam Chair.
conceptually first. Yes, Madam Mayor.
I understand that the District Elections Committee is asking for more time to work with Mr. Kalan. I think Mr. Kalan has worked with the committee and the community they represent and their ideals and their ideas a sufficient time. I think we need to move it forward. And at this point, I'd like to stay open to the appointment process to fill council vacancies. When Mr. Rouse was appointed the first time, there was 45 applicants, a really diverse group of men, women, ages, ethnicities too. And when we had the appointment process for District 3, there were a lot of women candidates. And then once we went to special election, we lost all the gender balance. With all due respect to Elizabeth Hunter, who's now running for District 3, I don't see her as a viable candidate in terms of her activity in the context of what we're talking about today, not any opinion on that political race. So unfortunately, for us who are looking for diversity in candidates, the appointment process seems to be giving us that more than a special election. So I'd like to stay open to that until we have a broader city council discussion. The cost of special elections, we have to take that into account. Our budget is tight now. This cycle, it might get more abundant later, or it might get tighter later. So those are two reasons why I'm open to the appointment process. And we are elected up here to make difficult decisions, like appointing someone to a district-based in a district-based election system to an open a vacancy in a certain district that's not our own. We do have that ability to choose people and to put the candidates through their paces, the applicants through their paces. I'm saying that with all due respect to people who hold otherwise. And that's where I stand on that for now. Thanks.
Thank you. Mayor Pro Tem Rouse?
Thank you. Yeah, no, I agree with Mayor Murillo on those points. I'm a little curious as to a legal opinion about the eligibility for an appointee to then subsequently run. I understand the point Judge Ochoa made about the power of the incumbency. Are there any prejudicial pitfalls in telling someone that they cannot run for office based on that? Can they be automatically disqualified from participating in that process because we say so? Or is that something that is a more technical question? And the reason why I ask that is that I do believe there is a power of the incumbency, but I also believe that I'd hate to limit our choice from somebody who was an exceptionally good candidate that served well, and then suddenly because of that artificial disqualification couldn't continue to serve. Mr. Kalan, do you have an opinion on that?
I don't at this time. I haven't looked at whether it raises questions. I tend to think that if there is a knowing and voluntary waiver, that you could require that in the charter. I haven't looked at it. I haven't looked at San Francisco's charter, and that it's in San Francisco doesn't mean it's necessarily been challenged and upheld. But I think it's doable. I'd be happy to look at that if that's the direction you want to go.
Well, it's kind of the same larger argument about term limits in general, and oftentimes there are particularly good servants that if you had the choice, you'd elect them again. But because you can't, because of this barrier we put in, for the reasons I understand as well, but at some point in time, you need the best person, no matter who that is and what they've done. So I'd like to pursue that question a little bit and just see what could and couldn't be done and what the proper logic is to put forward to the voters.
Okay, and I'm happy to look at the legal side of it. In terms of the logic of incumbency or not, though, it's really a core political question. So I've got to avoid getting in. Of course, I love incumbents, you know that. But I've got to avoid getting into that question.
Did you have any other comments on this at this point? I have a few. Well, one is a question. I think we've heard conflicting costs. Do we know what the actual cost is of a special election?
We know what we've been told for this November, which I understand to be about $180,000. Extrapolating beyond that, we haven't done well. So,
okay. So
it was less than 300. The $300,000 number, where's Mr. Ebenstein, was tossed around last fall, and it was wrong. So I think that's why he was remembering that.
Yeah. And I think our city council has been doing very well with our limited number, but I do miss having a district representative from District 3, even though that's where you're coming from. Then the mayor now has a dual role of both representing the city at large and a district in a way by giving voice to that. And I think on so many important decisions we've already had where I would have felt we really would have benefited at least from a voice from District 3 even if it was by appointment from those not in District 3, it would at least be a voice for District 3, which right now is has to be balanced all the time with the city at large issue as well from a mayor's perspective. I would be interested in if there are less than 2 years to fill, then possibly an appointment, and if there are more than 2 years to fill, then a special election somewhere between the two, where if it's an extended term beyond 2 years, then we give that back to, then that's worth the extra expense to give the voters the opportunity to weigh in on that. I would also add that when Mayor Pro Tem Rouse was appointed, it was at large, so he was being appointed by representatives also from the city at large. So the situation where you have filling a vacancy by people who are explicitly not from that district, I'm very uncomfortable with. I would, if I were to vacate my district seat and then I am familiar with the issues of my district and then was counting on the rest of the council, whom I trust and hold in high regard, I'm just not sure you would have the same perspective as someone from the district helping to select that. Having said that, I did think we had a really qualified, excellent pool, District 3, that would have been, I think we would have had the extra voice of that district on council, and the empty seat, I mean, I really feel the weight of the empty seat, not having that extra vote. So I'm wondering what you two think about maybe if it's 2 years or more left to be filled, then that goes to special election. And if it is 2 years or less left to be filled, then it's by appointment.
Madam Chair, in my opinion, that because the elections do come up every 2 years, that particular district, the vacancy could, like Mr. Hart's situation, could be a longer situation. But the ability to vote on the next scheduled election, number one, economically makes more sense. The big number actually did come from a special standalone election as opposed to going to the county cycle. So it wasn't particularly wrong. But so I think it's kind of already built in. I think it's going to take some extraordinary circumstances. And I would prefer to get this ballot language as simple as we possibly can so there's the greatest understanding of what we're going forward and doing. So I don't know if that necessarily complicates it, but it's one more factor in my book.
And then that if you're talking about the District 6 seat, is it 2 years or more or 2 years and less? It's 2 years. So how would we decide how to fill Mr. Hart's seat? It's 2 years, exactly. So we would have to make a decision if it's...
Would it not be 3 years?
No, because he would get sworn in January of 2019.
After having served 1 year.
It's 2 years exactly. Am I right?
I won't know until I count the days. No, I don't think it's exact. I mean, he was seated January 9th, 2018. I don't know the seating date at the county.
The same January, the first
meeting
in January. Yeah.
I agree with Councilmember Rouse that it does need to be as simple as possible. I appreciate where you're going, trying to find a balance there. I was generally satisfied with what the city attorney had presented to us. And it was more clear to me when I read it until we started asking questions. But now I think I'm back to appreciating the need for the even year question, settling the Hal Conklin question. And also, I believe it should be two separate provisions on the ballot so that people could understand, okay, we're talking about this and now we're talking about this. And I trust our voters to do their homework and to vote appropriately. Thank you.
Mayor Pro Tem Rouse?
Yeah, I agree with the mayor's comments. I also don't want to truncate any possibility for further dialogue between Judge Ochoa and Mr. Kalan, if there's any, things that can simplify it or move towards more common language. But I agree the way things have been presented to us on the exhibits and the small changes we've made, I'm fine going forward the way they are as well.
Can we discuss then, is the appointee, if you go along with having it appointed, will be allowed to run again, not allowed to run again? What is your position on that?
My personal opinion is I don't want to artificially truncate or disqualify someone. And once again, understanding the point about the power of the incumbency, I absolutely agree with that. But the other side of the coin is you may find that person you want to have as your public servant going forward.
I agree with that, with all due respect to Judge Ochoa and the committee.
And then I have a question about that. Given the Benalis judgment says nominated or elected by people of the district, how do we address that if we go with an appointment? Or
even Mr. Ebenstein said that was an inference and not a hardcore provision. Did you hear the question, Mr. Kalan? That Mr. Ebenstein had said, I guess it's in the first sentence.
Yes, Madam Chair, members of the committee, there is not a requirement for elections at all times in the settlement agreement. It's silent for the most part. The only place it directly addresses vacancies is in considering what would have happened had someone elected in 2013 or 2015 vacated office. So the Banyales settlement actually provides that vacancies in the 2013 seats that were there until 2017 would be filled from the city at large in accordance with the applicable law. So it which was an appointment. So it really doesn't address it. So from my standpoint, I understand the plaintiff's settlement, but rather than torture the agreement, I think it's more accurate that the issue simply was not resolved. And that means that neither the council nor the plaintiffs expressed any opposition to having special elections versus appointments. The only issue that was discussed that did not end up being addressed was even-year elections. And at that time, there was no interest on the part of any of the parties in moving that direction. So the settlement is really silent, and so I think this is a political judgment call, not a question of law.
I will say on that I would also not like to truncate this going to the full council. I would like to see a paragraph draft of what that paragraph would look like if we did go to the next general election cycle. We have it written here without that direction, and if that would be acceptable to have that available when we do bring it to full council, so that the two could be compared. Yeah.
My question for the committee, would that be something more than what Judge Ochoa has drafted, or would you like us to?
No, I think that would be.
So I can produce that, but then the statement would be that the committee just asked me to draft it for comparison purposes, not that I'm recommending it or anything.
Correct. Not that you're recommending it, but in your language, the way you see that it fits within the charter,
Yeah, that would be, I'd be happy to work to come up with joint language on that. In terms of, back to Mayor Pro Tem Rouse, unless you arm me with some direction, I'm really not able to meet and do a lot of work with them because your decisions are the ones that matters on this. But I can write alternative language for your consideration or the council's.
Madam Chair, I'm also a little concerned with, even though there seems to be time, I just know what workload is like with staff, and I know what our timing is like to get this bundled up in time to get it to the county in a timely manner. So I would, for one, like to move forward with what little nuances we have changed and the presentation of staff recommendations going forward
And then still
to
present.
the full council.
Still present the Ochoa options to the full council.
Well, no. I mean, to present staff's, the discussion will be there. You know, I don't know that I'm going to try to direct Mr. Kalan to draft something else to put up there. I don't think that's necessary in this circumstance. I'm sure that judge and company will be there for the full council presentation. We'll have a robust discussion about it, but I don't want to complicate the menu more than it is.
Mayor Murillo?
You need a motion.
Yes, please.
Oh, wait. Oh, go ahead. I mean, you're going to make a motion. I still
Okay,
have-
make a motion,
yeah.
then we can talk about it some
Okay.
more. Well, it's getting close to 2 o'clock. So I move that we respectfully end discussion with the committee. Move forward to the city council a recommendation to I need to look at the to make charter amendments in a ballot with ballot language that spells out the the change to district elections separately from even year elections. We recommend to the city council the change in the gender pronouns, and that we recommend to the city council further discussion about filling council vacancies. I'm sorry, because I'm ready for, I think Mr. Rouse and I are in agreement. I'm being sensitive to you because you're not agreeing with us.
I appreciate that.
So let me just stop there. And then that we can agree on, what I've just said, unless you had something else.
Do you want to add moving to even years to your motion, or have that
Yes,
separate?
and moving to even years. Should I redo my motion? Was it a little too much?
Question, and the language about the 24-month period, we talked to Mr. Kalan about inserting, what constitutes a full term, what constitutes the correct amount of time
Right.
between eligibility to run.
We agreed on that one.
Right, but it needs to be part of the motion, I believe.
Okay.
Yes, I have 3 edits that would be part of the motion. The first is to remove the 2 words "at large" from section 500 in the Voter Participation Rights Act attachment 2. The second is to add language to 500.1 in both sections that recognizes service of 2 years or more, appointed or elected, constitutes a full term for the purposes of term limits. So those 3 changes are what I had.
My motion incorporates those 3 edits. So that's everything except the council seat vacancy, right?
Is your motion suggesting that it is still available to talk to the full council about 503 filling vacancies at the next general election? Is that still open to discuss? by your motion or not?
Madam Mayor, I'm trying, Madam Mayor and Madam Chair, the motion included further to the council discussion of the vacancy process. So I understood that discussion will happen there. What's not yet clear is whether I'm writing anything.
Mr. Rouse had suggested we go with Judge Ochoa's, if that's what I thought that's what you said. You didn't want Mr. Kalan to write anything new. There's a good suggestion from the committee.
Right, I don't want to direct our council to try to present someone else's work or opinion. I think that we'll get what we have from Mr. Kalan, and Mr. Ochoa I'm sure will be presenting to full council.
Okay, so that does cover everything.
I believe it does cover everything, as long as, so 503 will continue to be discussed, also with the Ochoa option included, maybe not drafted by you or written by you, but just as it was included in our packet today.
Yes, I just for my own way of thinking things through, I'm going to write it. I'll have it in my back pocket and all. I can't.
Sure.
You know what I mean? It's like show your work kind of thing. So I'm not hearing you telling me don't do any work. What you're saying is don't present as if it's from the committee a change that would alter what you've discussed today.
I'm okay with that.
Yes.
Are you okay with that?
Yes, exactly.
We have a
And also,
motion.
point for clarification, we are still talking about 2 charter amendments, right?
Yes.
Okay, very good.
Do we have a second?
I'll second.
Okay. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. And with that, we will adjourn the meeting. Thank you.